comes into effect from 1/9/2010. One thing, it is not retrospective. That is certain, clear beyond doubts. But look at another issue. What is the other issue? The other issue is you have entered into a transaction before 1/9/2010. Given that particular property, not registered. Registration takes place subsequent to 1/9/2010. Whether assessing officer can invoke 56(7). Answer: by no stretch of imagination, such a transaction would attract the question of inadequate consideration or gift. Reason: the reason is that, see, here is a property. Property was conveyed. Documentations have taken place. Consideration received. Possession given. Conveyance not given. In such an eventuality, the position in law is clear, looking into the intention of the legislature to introduce a section from 1/9/2010. The fact that the conveyance deed is given for registration to a stamp duty authority subsequently cannot attract, by any stretch of imagination, provisions of 56 subclause 7, because the entire transaction has already taken place. A mere postponement of conveyance has no effect. This brings me to the doctrine of relation back. In law, you have this concept of relation back, and the doctrine of relation back makes it very clear that if a transaction is done, the subsequent point, which is only a formality to be complied with, that particular formality relates back to the original date on which the transaction had taken place. This brings me to the next very important issue, because on immovable properties, you have got various encumbrances, various adverse possessions, various different titles, life interest, partitions, remainderment's interest. Let me analyze this issue for you. The first proposition generally that I'm placing before you is that if there is an encumbrance on property and you remove the encumbrance, the removal of the encumbrance is part of cost of acquisition as contemplated, or cost of improvement as contemplated in section 48, and has to be considered in the computation of long-term capital gains. I have selected some leading decisions. The first case is the case of CIT versus Sona Sundarajan, which is reported in 150 ITR, page 80, decision of the Madras High Court. In this case, mother had a right to stay in the property by virtue of a partition in which there was life interest given to the mother. The brothers wanted to sell the property, and therefore the mother was given 60,000 rupees to vacate the property. The amount was shown as cost of acquisition, cost of improvement, and capital gains was computed accordingly. ITO accepted it. The CIT, exercising revisional powers under 263, invoked revisional powers as order prejudicial to the interest of revenue. In this case, the Madras High Court very correctly upheld the order of the tribunal in 150 ITR, page 80, laying down the proposition that if a life interest in the property has to be removed so that the property could be sold, such an encumbrance forms part of the cost, and capital gains would be computed subject to the deduction of that section. Then came the decision in 197 ITR, Gujarat High Court in CIT versus Daksha Ramanlal. In Daksha Ramanlal's case, Gujarat High Court was confronted with a land on which there was mortgage of the property. A very important proposition laid down was, the court said, property is a very wide term import. It can mean physical property, it can mean ownership of the property, it can also include rights in the property, it could include possessory rights in the property, it could include only certain rights like a mortgagee, like a lessee, like a remainder man. All these rights emanate from the property, and these rights are therefore capital assets within the meaning of section 214. Once you say that the rights are capital assets, are for sure capital gains would arise on those properties. In this case, when land was transferred subject to mortgagee's right, the Gujarat High Court correctly held that the mortgage which is to be cleared as an encumbrance on the property partakes the character of cost of acquisition which is to be taken into consideration. This view was upheld by the Supreme Court in the case of CIT versus Arunachalam, reported in 227 ITR, page 222. Supreme Court said that any encumbrance which is there has to be removed, and that is very important. But look at an interesting case of the Bombay High Court in Bradford's case. In Bradford's case, there was property. There was shareholders. Shareholders claim right over the property. The shareholders said that no, company did not sell the property in the best interest. It was a litigation on minorities' interest under the Companies Act. In this case, the Mumbai High Court held that when a settlement takes place and a shareholder is paid an amount for a particular property so that the property can be sold, in those circumstances, it is part of the cost of acquisition. Pausing here for a moment, I'm going one step further. Here was a litigation because of property. They said that this is a part of cost. I'm going one step further. For a shareholder who creates nuisance value, if amount is paid to the shareholder to buy peace so that the company carries on the business or settles a litigation, it can even be revenue expenditure under 37(1). Just think it over. Bradford's case of the Bombay High Court proceeded because of this. I'm going to the other extreme, that it can even be section 37(1). Then came an interesting case of Ashok Soy, Delhi High Court 287 ITR. Ashok Soy's case was a case of partition. Proposition emerging: if there is partition by way of a family settlement, then such a partition would be valid. Point number 2. If there is a partition by virtue of an arbitration award, partition is valid. Number 3, if there is oral partition by virtue of which the property is given, partition takes place, partition amounts to transfer. This is the bottom line of it. But in Ashok Soy's case, the important point was that transfer was made to an outsider who was not a member of the family. Therefore, in this case, distinguishing other case, the court came to the conclusion that no, you have to look at the totality of the transaction. This is not a partition, but a payment made to an outsider, and therefore not a family settlement, not liable to tax. Friends, I had still a lot of things to say, but because of the constraint of time, let me just bring one additional point to you. Because I'm on family settlement, I would like to conclude by a classic decision of the special bench of the tribunal, which is reported in 111